Good morning. We're continuing our study today through the books of Second Corinthians and Galatians, and we're going to be picking up this week in Second Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and grab them and be turning there, and we'll be getting into that text here in just a minute. Through our study so far through the book of Second Corinthians, we've seen Paul go to great lengths to defend the authenticity of his apostolic ministry. In trying to do this, he's discussed his ministry in a number of ways. He described his ministry as being a ministry of honesty. He described what the different things that motivated him in his ministry, and he even discussed several characteristics of his ministry that helped demonstrate that he was solely focused on carrying out the will of God and not his own. But as we get into chapters 8 and 9, Paul takes a break from defending his apostleship and discusses this idea of financial stewardship. Now, I think it's important that we understand the context of this discussion. See, during this time, the churches in Jerusalem and the saints in Judea, they were really struggling in a pretty serious way. And Paul, recognizing their struggles, he traveled to the churches in the area and encouraged them to begin taking up a collection that he could then deliver and help the churches there to be able to continue on in their ministry. See, they'd been struggling to be able to continue moving forward in what God had called them to do. And so Paul, in recognizing this, he takes this time to encourage these other churches to help them in their ministry. So he's asking for this collection. And so here in chapters 8 and 9, he addresses the church in Corinth about this concept, about giving back to the work of the Lord. So with that context in mind, let's go ahead and begin our study here, starting in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So as Paul begins his discussion of financial stewardship with the church in Corinth, he begins by pointing them to the churches in Macedonia and for them to look at those churches as examples of what a giving church looks like. Let's notice the way Paul described the church in Macedonia in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. It says, "Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much more urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering of the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God." So as Paul is beginning this discussion, he points the church in Corinth to the churches in Macedonia. And he says, look to them and see the example of what it means to be a church that's giving back, a church that's focused on showing the Lord their love for him by giving of their means. But what I want us to notice is what Paul brings to our attention that makes the giving of the church in Macedonia stand out among the other and to make them be so commendable. First off, notice what he says in verse 2. He said the reason their giving was so special and so commendable was because they gave out of affliction or out of poverty. See, even in less than ideal circumstances, they still gave with joy, recognizing the importance of the cause they were giving to. See, I think it would have been easy for them in those moments to realize their own struggles and realize their own challenges and recognize that maybe they aren't in abundance when it comes to wealth and goods. And I think it would have been easy for them to decide maybe they're not able to help out in this time. But even in affliction and even in poverty, they still found joy in giving back to the work of the Lord. But notice what he says in verse 3. He said they gave beyond what they were even able. See, there were many people that were living in poverty, that were struggling, allowing ends to meet. But yet they still gave beyond what they even were able to give. See, they recognized that by serving God and giving back to God, that God was going to take care of them and He's going to provide for them. So they gave beyond what they were even able to do. But in verse 4, we see the purpose of their giving. See, they were willing to give beyond what they were able to give because they recognized that these ministries they were giving back to couldn't be accomplished if it wasn't for this gift. See, whether we like to admit it or not, most things in life can only function properly when we have the financial means to make it happen. Many ministries are the same way. The only way that ministries can be completed effectively is if we have the funds and the means to do them properly. See, the church in Macedonia recognized that in order for the churches in Jerusalem and the saints in Judea, in order for them to be able to carry out the ministry that was set before them, they needed money. And if those ministries were going to be accomplished, then it was going to be because of people like the Macedonians and other churches that were going to give back and help make that happen. So they understood the purpose of this giving, and that purpose drove them to give beyond what they were even able to give. But as we look at verse 5, we see the real secret in their giving. We see the reason why they were able to stand out as being this church, as being this congregation that was known as a giving church. See, we're told in verse 5 that the reason they were willing to give back so much to the work of ministry was because they first gave themselves to the Lord. Because of the relationship that they had with God, they were motivated to give back in a powerful way. See, they recognized that all that God had done for them. And as a result, they were willing to sacrifice a little extra of themselves, knowing that God would continue to watch over them and bless them. See, the church in Macedonia was not only an incredible example for the church in Corinth of what it means to give back to the Lord, but they're an incredible example for us. Have we given ourselves to the Lord and to His cause? And does our giving demonstrate it? Now, as we think about this church in Macedonia, we recognize that when we've truly given ourselves to the Lord, then it's noticeable in our actions. It's noticeable in the way we give back and the way we treat others. And because they had first given themselves to the Lord, they were willing to give back in a powerful way to continue helping the ministry all over the world continue. So as Paul begins this discussion of financial stewardship, he first points the church in Corinth to the example of the Macedonians. And it challenges them to look at those churches as an example and to follow after their example. So as Paul continues, he shifts attention from the Macedonians and now shares this message to the church in Corinth to try to encourage them to continue to give in a powerful way. As we think about this message he was giving, he begins by encouraging them to abound in their giving in verses 6 and 7. As Paul begins this discussion, he points out and he acknowledges the fact that there were a lot of things that the church in Corinth did very well. There were a lot of things that they abounded in, they excelled in as a congregation. And he mentioned a few. He said they abounded in faith and in speech, in knowledge, in diligence, and in love. There were a lot of things that they were really good at. But Paul's message to them was not to be content with where they were. Although they were great in these things, don't be content with just that, but continue to grow and develop and abound in other things as well. And one of those things he's pushing them to abound in is their giving. Find opportunities to give back to further the work of the church. And in order to help them with this, we're told that Paul sent Timothy to help them organize and implement this ministry. Titus came to help push them in this direction, to help them grow and to help organize this ministry of giving back. Paul wanted them to understand how important this ministry was. And so Titus was there to help them along the way. So this first part of this message he shares with the church in Corinth was to abound in giving, continue to grow and develop this. And to help them abound in their giving, in verse 9, he points them to the example of Jesus. He said, look to Jesus, look to the example of Jesus as one who gave everything, as one who allowed himself to become poor so that we might become rich. And he said, by looking to the example of Jesus, we should find motivation to give back liberally ourselves. See, Jesus being rich as deity in heaven, he left heaven to take on the form of man, where he was mocked and he was ridiculed and he was rejected and he was hung on the cross, so that the very people who put him on that cross could have an opportunity to find riches in heaven. See, while there's nothing that the church in Corinth or us today we could ever give back that would ever equal what Jesus gave, Paul's challenge was to look to the example of what Jesus gave and the extent that Jesus gave, and use that as motivation to give back even beyond what we're able to give. Jesus gave so much. And Paul's challenge is to try to follow suit and give just as Jesus gave. Well, the third part of his message for them in verses 12 through 15 was that through this giving, they'd be meeting the needs of one another. See, Paul reminds them that they're not giving back just so others can have excess or so that others can have an abundance, but they're giving back so that those who are in need can have what they need to get by. See, the point of all this was not that although the churches may be struggling with their own things, it wasn't so that they would be struggling even more, but it was to help elevate those who are in need. Paul's pointing to these churches in Jerusalem and the saints in Judea and reminding them of the challenges that they're facing. And this gift that they were able to give would be able to help alleviate and ease some of the pain of their situation. Paul wanted the church in Corinth to realize that by meeting the needs of others during their time of need, that they would be more inclined to help them when they found themselves in a time of need. You see, there may be a chance, there may be a time in the future where the church in Corinth was going to be in the same situation and in the same needs as the churches in Jerusalem. And Paul said, when you help them and help them continue in their ministry, that maybe when you're struggling, they're going to be able to help you in the same way. See, here he's pointing to the universal aspect of the church here. We're all together and we're aware of each other's struggles and we help each other when we're struggling. And Paul said, if you help them, they in turn may be able to help you in the future. See, when we think about helping the Lord's church, we understand that ministry at one location is just as important as ministry in other locations. And when one area is struggling, we need to be there to help one another, to help that ministry continue to help bring more people to the Lord. And that was the message that Paul was sharing here with the church in Corinth. So as Paul concludes this discussion on the message that he's sharing with them, he now shifts his focus to the messengers that he was going to be sending to help collect this gift and to help distribute this gift. While Paul is taking a break from focusing on defending his apostleship here in chapters 8 and 9, he still takes a minute to defend himself from those who may question the integrity of this gift. There were people that may be questioning the motivation behind Paul and getting this collection. And was he really going to deliver it where it needs to be delivered? Or was he doing this for himself? Paul anticipated there were going to be people that were going to have these questions. And so he takes a minute and he presents some precautions that he took in order to keep the giving above reproach so people couldn't question it. And the precautions that he took were ensuring that he had travel companions that were with him that could vouch for him and what he was doing. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 16 through 24, we see this discussion. We see Paul name several men who he had called to go with him as they were going to collect this money and to distribute this money to the churches in Jerusalem. One of the men that he discusses, we see in verse 18, was a man who's not named, but he's described as one whose praise in the service of the gospel was known throughout all the churches. Okay, so all of the churches in the area, they knew of this man, they knew of his heart, they knew of his faith, they recognized who he was, and he was a man that they could trust. It's thought by many that this man that they're suggesting here was Luke, which could make sense. We know that Luke was very involved in the ministry of Paul and traveled with him on a number of occasions. And he was a man that Paul trusted and knew that if he was with him, he would be a help to him and not hinder his ministry. So this first man that he has go with him, whether it was Luke or not, it was a man that the area churches were aware of. They knew who he was, and they knew of his faith, and they knew they could trust him. But there's a second man that he describes, another unnamed man that goes with him, verse 22. And this man is described as one who had proven to be diligent in the work of the Lord. So another man who people recognized his faith and recognized his work in ministry, and they could trust that he was going to be, that he had integrity in what they were doing. Finally, Paul reminds them that Titus was going to be traveling with them as well in verse 23. Now, this would have eased the minds of those in Corinth who may have been questioning the integrity of Paul with this gift, because they had personal relationships with Titus. Titus had spent a lot of time with them. So, in order to keep people from questioning the integrity of Paul in delivering this gift and collecting this gift, he chooses these three men to go with him so that there were other people that could vouch for what really happened with that gift. That they wouldn't have to trust that Paul did with it what he said he was going to do, but instead they could look to these other men and they could vouch for him and make it clear that Paul truly did deliver that gift to the struggling churches, just as he had said he would. So after discussing the travel companions that were going to be with him as they were collecting these funds and distributing these funds. Paul then shares in chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, his plan for the collection. Now, it's important here that he addresses this with the church in Corinth because he was making his first stop was going to be to them. But before he describes this, notice verses 1 and 2. Because in verses 1 and 2, Paul does something that I think is brilliant. See, as he started this discussion in chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, he pointed the attention of the church in Corinth to the churches in Macedonia. Right? They showed that they were a church that had the right attitudes when it comes to giving. But now, in chapter 9, Paul explains to the church in Corinth that he has used them as an example to many other congregations of what it means to be willing to give. You see, evidently, Paul had been talking about this giving for the past year, and he had been going and talking to these churches and presenting this idea to them. And from the first time that Paul mentioned it to the church in Corinth, he said that they expressed a sincere desire to give back and help out the churches in Jerusalem. From the very beginning, they were ready and willing to give back. They were passionate about it. And because of their willingness, Paul, as he went to these other churches, he bragged on the church in Corinth for their willingness. So now here, these people that he's writing to help encourage to give back, he explains to them that he's been proud of what they were doing and their attitudes and their willingness to do this. And he's been boasting to other people about them. Because of their willingness to participate, other churches became more willing and motivated to give back as well. This is Paul pulling a brilliant move to help shift the focus of some of this away from the questions that maybe people are bringing to now the ministry and the purpose of what we're doing. But again, the reason that Paul is talking to them about these plans is because when they went to collect these funds, their first stop was going to be the church in Corinth. And so he wanted them to make sure that they had the gift ready and they were going to be prepared to hand off that gift when they arrived. Because he had bragged so much on them, he said, I don't want you or me to be ashamed when I get there and nothing's ready. He said, make sure the gift is ready because I've been bragging on you about what you're doing. So when we get there, we can collect the gift and then travel on to these other places and continue gathering the funds to take to Jerusalem. So Paul here discusses this idea of these messengers, how he's going to have help who's going to be going with him to make sure that this gift and this planning is all going to be above reproach. And he shares his plan for this collection that he and his messengers are going to be following through on. But as Paul concludes this discussion on financial stewardship, in chapter 9, verses 6 through 15, Paul talks about the motivation behind giving. And while this motivation would have been so important for the church in Corinth and the other churches in the area during that time, it's something that should motivate us in our giving back to the Lord as well. But let's notice this motivation that Paul sets forward. He's already talked about a few others previously in these two chapters, but there are three other motivational factors that he wants to give here that are very practical. The first one he shares in verse 6 is that we reap what we sow. You see, if a farmer were to only plant sparingly for a season, then he would have no one to blame but himself when he didn't have a big harvest, right? If he doesn't plant very much, he can't expect to harvest very much. The same thing is true when it comes to giving back to the Lord. The more we give to the Lord, the more he's going to bless us in return. And Paul wanted the church in Corinth to understand this. If we sow sparingly, we're going to reap sparingly. But if we sow bountifully, then we'll reap bountifully, and the Lord will bless us through our giving. The second motivational factor he shares is that God loves a cheerful giver. Verse 7. See, Paul encourages them to be aware of the attitude with which they give. The heart of our giving is just as important as the gift itself. You see, when we are people that are motivated to give because it's something we're passionate about, because we understand the importance of it, because it's something that we feel moved to do, then that gift is going to come across and feel very differently to us than something that we're obligated to give. And Paul wanted the church in Corinth to understand that they were to give what they were capable of giving. To not give out of obligation. But instead, they were to give with a cheerful heart, knowing that their gift was going to make a difference for the Lord and for his church. Our heart is so crucial when it comes to our giving. And the expectation that God has for us when we're giving is that we do it cheerfully because of the difference it's making. But finally, the third motivational factor that Paul shares in verses 8 through 15 is that we should be motivated because we're meeting the needs of others. He said, because of their gift in verse 10, the Lord's going to be able to accomplish powerful things and big things in Jerusalem and with the saints of Judea. By giving back to the Lord, the work of the Lord is going to be accomplished on a much greater scale. They're going to be able to do so much more and accomplish so much more in Jerusalem because of this gift that they're giving to the church in Jerusalem. This gift was to strengthen the church, verse 12, so that they could continue working for the Lord. See, by giving back to the Lord, they were making a difference in the kingdom of God. And Paul wanted to make sure that the church in Corinth knew this. He wanted them to understand that this gift wasn't for Paul. This gift was for the Lord. And by recognizing that, hopefully, it would motivate them to give maybe beyond what they were able to give. So in this discussion that Paul has of this financial stewardship, he encourages them to be people who are willing to give back, who have attitudes and hearts of giving, that aren't concerned about themselves as much as they're concerned about following through and helping the mission and the ministry of the church to continue to prosper. He said, look to the church in Macedonia as an example of what a giving church looks like. He said, understand that Christ gave back so much for you, and you should be willing to give back for him. And he said we should be motivated by the results that come because we give back to the Lord when we see ministries being able to continue and the work of the kingdom be able to expand farther and farther throughout this world. So that concludes Paul's discussion here of this financial stewardship from 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. And we'll pick up next week as we get into chapters 10 and 11 of 2 Corinthians. Thank you all very much.